I want to start by going over the outline of the classes upcoming. We're going to start with a review today of global purchasing. It's just a general introduction of the topic. Next week, we're going to go into detail on the RFQ, the request for quote. The RFQ is really the single most important activity that a purchasing manager does. If you do your RFQ right, you get valid responses back from quality suppliers that tell you exactly what they can deliver by when. You can evaluate those and make the correct decision, and you're off. You're off and running. If a good RFQ gives you great results and really sets you along the path to success. Now, if you don't, then we get into the following week. We're going to talk about quality control, tolerances, verification checks, and penalties. So it's very important when you do issue the RFQ that you've properly defined the RFQ. You've properly defined what the tolerances are that are acceptable for the product and how you expect the supplier to check and verify that the parts are correct and appropriate for production. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the whole quality control process and how purchasing gets tightly involved with quality control, because again, purchasing is responsible for all the purchased items. That means anything that goes wrong, anything that's wrong with the quality of a purchased part becomes the responsibility of purchasing. Now, next we're going to talk about cost estimating. This is really critical. You need to know how much things cost, and you can't just depend on the suppliers and the competitive bid process to tell you what things are worth. You really you need to go into these discussions and go into negotiation with an understanding of what does it cost the suppliers to produce. So we're going to tell you that. We're going to go over, how to estimate what the cost of any item is going to be. And we'll show you how this ties into the purchasing contracts and how you should be structuring your purchasing contracts. And we'll also cover negotiation. But the most important element of negotiation is to be a knowledgeable purchaser, and that's where cost estimating really plays a critical role. Next, we'll talk about sourcing decision, because how do you find the right suppliers? How do you investigate and search and find these companies out on a global basis? So we'll go through various methodologies for finding and qualifying suppliers. Next, we'll talk about measuring, planning, reporting, and analysis, because anything that we do, we need to measure. We need to measure our effectiveness. We need to figure out what's working, what doesn't work, where we can improve, what the opportunities are for improvement. And be careful what you measure, because that's what you'll optimize. So we'll talk about how to measure the right things to measure purchasing effectiveness. Now that concludes the first half of the course, and it really covers the basics of purchasing. Then what we're going to do is talk about specific types of items that we might buy. So on the 30th, we're going to talk about purchasing, market research, advertising, and trade shows. There's a wonderful quote from Ogilvy, who states that half the advertising that I spend my money on is wasted. I just don't know which half. Purchasing market research is particularly challenging, and there's real opportunities for cost improvement, and purchasing can really lead that effort to ensure that you're getting the appropriate level of support that you need, the correct information, and that you're doing it in the most expeditious and judicious manner with your capital. Next, we'll talk about engineering services and contract production. Very different than market research. I mean, here you know exactly what it is that you're buying. You know the value of everything. This is where cost estimating becomes a very useful tool. And with engineering services, you really need to develop something called a statement of work. So we'll really talk about the statement of work and what's in scope and out of scope, and how to manage engineering service contracts. Next, we'll talk about production tooling. Production tooling is the most important decision that your company makes as a company. You don't buy production tools often. Maybe this is a twice a year or once a year purchase, but it's something that you're going to buy, that you're going to put into production for many years to come, hopefully. And any mistake that is developed or anything that's wrong in the product, you're probably not going to have time to correct the production tool. Production tools could take 6 months or a year or longer to produce. So it's going to take a long time before any error becomes clear, and by that point it may be too late to correct, or too expensive to correct. So you end up living with those inconsistencies or those inefficiencies, and worse than that, it's your customer that lives with with a less than fully acceptable product. So production tooling really is a critical decision. It's not something you make very often, but it is a very critical decision, and we'll talk about how to do it right. And we'll give you a checklist to make sure, because you don't do it often, you really need to rely on having a correct checklist to make sure that you've really covered all the basics with production tooling. Okay, so what does the employer expect out of purchasing? And as the picture indicates here, it's an awful lot. So let's go over it. Your employer expects you to be a cost expert that fully understands everything to do with the parts that you're buying, that you're able to read the drawings and figure out who should produce these parts and how much these parts should cost, and which manufacturers are the best manufacturers to source this particular part, and how do you ensure that the supplier puts his best people on. They expect you to know who their best people are, or who their best machines are. Your employer expects you to ensure that the supplier is putting their best efforts to deliver the parts on time, on cost, and on quality. They really expect you to be the complete technical expert on the part. Now, it's not just that. That wouldn't be so bad, but you need to do this for metal parts, for metal stampings and CNC parts. You need to be able to do it for plastic parts, for injection mold or vacuum form parts. You need to be able to do it for large assemblies. You need to be able to do this for company equipment and tools and jigs, and of course company cars and office equipment and advertising and contract professionals, and of course transportation services. And you have to know how to do this all over the world, and you've got to do it all by Tuesday. Now, not so bad. The reality is, we don't have to be product experts. It helps. It helps a lot. It helps to have some solid knowledge on what the products are and what the products are comprised of. But really, purchasing, you need to be a communications expert. Purchasing is the conduit between our business and the outside suppliers. It's how we communicate what we need and who will supply it, by when, and what are the conditions and the requirements, what's the price and the packaging and the shipping, what are the payment terms, what's acceptable quality and performance. You really need to be that full communication source between the company and the supply base. Okay? Purchasing can play a critical role in the overall enterprise, not only securing the supply, but providing the company with competitive information and possibly locking out suppliers from other competitors.